Today's daf is Menachos daf Samachay, and we are at the top of daf Samachay Amid Aleph at the Mishnah. So the topic of the sixth parak of Masechtas Menachos is the Korban Omer, which was primarily a Korban Mincha. Thus, it's in Masechtas Menachos, also known as the Minchas HaOmer. So the Minchas HaOmer is discussed in very great detail in Parshas Emor. It's actually tucked away right in middle of the Parsha the Mayadim. So the Torah talks about the Yontif of Pesach, and right after the Yontif of Pesach, the pasuk says as follows: "Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Leimer, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yamarta aleim, ki savoyu ala aretz asher ani noisin lochem." When you're going to go to Eretz Yisrael, uktzartem es kitzira, v'havesem es oimer, reishes kitzirchem el hakoyin. So we're going to come to Eretz Yisrael. Says the Torah, you should cut the kitzir. You should take an omer. An omer literally means an amount. It's a shear. Reishis ketzirchem, the first thing that you cut, and you should give it to the kohen. The heinav has the omer lifnei Hashem l'tzoinchem. What does the kohen do? He brings it lifnei Hashem, and he does tenufa. When does he do this tenufa? And these are the magic words. Mimacharas haShabbos yinifenu hakohen. The day after Shabbos. And the pasuk continues. Together with this omer, with the tenufa of the omer, Korban Oil was brought. Additionally, there was a mincha. Uminchasai shnei esroinim soiles belulu b'Hashem ishay l'Hashem reach nichayach v'niska yayin revi'as ahin. So the Torah says, Mimachras haShabbos, the day after Shabbos, you're supposed to take an omer. It's made up of a mincha and an oila, and you're supposed to bring it l'fnei Hashem. Says the pasuk, v'lechem v'koli v'karmel lo yisoichlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. This is a very, very important loisa say, and very controversial whether it's noyig b'zman hazeh b'chutz la'aretz or it's not noyig b'zman hazeh. But once upon a time, this was certainly very, very profound. And that is, the Torah says that before this korban was brought, you weren't allowed to eat lechem, not koli, and not caramel. Bekitzer, you weren't allowed to eat from the tfuah hachadasha, any new grains, until the korban was brought. Adav yachem as korban alekechem, chuka soilim l'doirei seichem, b'chol moishvei seichem. Then the Torah says, usfartom lechem mimachash ha-shabbos, miyoyim av yachem as soimer atnufa sheva shabbosois temimois tiyenu. That from the time that you bring this korban omer, miyoyim av yachem as soimer atnufa, you should count. How many days do you count? 7 weeks. Sheva Shabbosos Timimas Tiena. Ad Mimachash HaShabbos HaShvias Tisbru Chamishim Yoyim. In total, it's going to be that you counted 50 days. It's really 49 days. After Mincha Chadash Hashem. And then at the end of the 49 days, meaning on the 50th day, you should bring another korban mincha. Mimoshvei Seichem Taviu Lechem Tnufa Shtayim. And then the Torah describes that second korban mincha that's supposed to be brought. It's made up of 2 breads. Shtei HaLechem. It's the topic of so many of the dafin that we've learned over the last couple of weeks. And the Torah, again, in great detail, describes the karbanos that were brought on Shavuos, the karbanos of the Shtei HaLechem, and then at the very end, the Torah mentions the Yontif of Shavuos, very, very bekitzer, doesn't say anything about Matan Torah. It says, Ukrosem be'etzem hayoyim hazeh mikra kodesh yil lechem kol malachas avodah leisasu, chukas and then finally, very mysteriously, the Torah throws in one more pasuk. You should know, I'm talking about bringing all these different karbanos omer. You're bringing a korban omer from the Tfuah Chadasha, and then you're going to bring the Shtei HaLechem, that's also a Mincha Chadasha. Says the Torah, Leisachala pasadcha, bekutzrecha, v'leket kitzircha, leisalaket. There's something called leket, there's something called peya. Regardless, these psukim over here in Parashas Emor are the psukim that make up the makar, the source to the korban omer. But within this parsha, you have 2 additional very important parshas. You have the parsha of Sfiras HaOmer. You also have the parsha of the Shtei HaLechem. So what was the korban omer? The korban omer was a korban mincha. It was brought mimacharas haShabbos, and the reason it was so important is because the Torah says v'lechem, the koli, the caramel lo yisoichlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. You were not allowed to eat from the tfuah chadasha until the korban omer was brought. It's interesting. The korban omer is mentioned in Parshas Vayikra as well. So in Parshas Vayikra, Perek Beis, where the Torah talks about the Menachos. So the Torah mentions the Minchas Omer. It says, "Ve'intakriv minchas bikurim l'Hashem." If you're going to bring a minchas bikurim, aviv kalui ba'esh geres karmel takriv es minchas bikurecha v'nesato leo shemen v'samto leo levoina mincha. If you remember, we had a whole Amud Gemara that darshan this pasuk last week. But regardless, the Torah over here is talking about a mincha. It refers to it as a minchas bikurim l'Hashem. Zoktehel Gerashi, quoting Gemaras. What's the minchas bikurim? It means the minchas ha'omer. And the reason it's called the minchas bikurim, because if you think about it, the carbon was very similar to bikurim. What was bikurim? Reishis bikuri ad mascha tavi l'Hashem alekecha. Just like there's a concept of bechar. You take your firstborn, the shorei kesef ha'eis ki yivaled. So the bechar, what do? You give to the kohen. Even a firstborn child, you're supposed to give to the kohen. That's why you do pidyon haben. So you shouldn't have to give the child to the kohen. You're paid it for 5 slon. But the point is, there's a concept of reishis. There's a concept of bikurim that permeates many mitzvahs in the Torah, and the carbon omer is really a sif katan in the laws of bikurim. V'im takriv minchas bikurim l'Hashem, because that's what you're doing. You're taking the reishis k'tzirchem, and instead of keeping it for yourself, you're going ahead and you're giving it to the kohen. Ramei Simcha, Meshech Chochma, and a classic Meshech Chochma says that with this point, you could understand why the Torah very mysteriously, right at the end of that parasha, Parshas Emor, throws in the halacha of leket and throws in the halacha of peah. He says the Torah is coming to say that even if a person spends his 9 to 5 at the job and he does what he needs to do, Torah derech eretz, but at the same time his derech eretz should be surrounded with Torah. And he says that's what the Torah is telling you. The Torah says the first thing you do, you're a farmer, you work the field, the primary source of income, even for Haimish Yidden once upon a time was farmers, right? We all wore overalls once upon a time. But either way, that's the way it once was, right? So the first thing is bikurin, reishis, k'tzirchem. What are you supposed to do? That's the carbon omer. That goes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then there's something called leket. Leket, our halachas that guide the way you're supposed to be malaket. And then finally, when you're done, says the Torah, the Torah talks about the halacha peah. So you should be mukaf with mitzvahs. The beginning of your work, middle of the day, and then at the end. So literally from 9 to 5 you're surrounded. You start with the minchas bikurim, which is the carbon omer. Then you have a leket kitzircha loisalaket. That's as you're being malaket. And then when all is said and done, you have loisachala pa'asatcha. Regardless, this is the introduction to the carbon omer. But there's one other important thing that we need to speak out, and then the daf is going to flow. And that is, the Torah never said when you're supposed to bring the carbon omer. The Torah makes a very big deal about the carbon omer. There's so many psukim in the Torah, a very rich parsha here, tucked away in the middle of the parsha Me'adam. You read this is Kriyas HaTorah on Yontav. But the Torah doesn't say when you're supposed to do it. In fact, what the Torah does say is it's supposed to be mimachras HaShabbos, which literally sounds like on Sunday. So pick a Sunday that's convenient, where the weather's supposed to be good, and that's when you're supposed to do it. So what does mimachras HaShabbos mean? So Kiyadua, there was a machlokes between the Prushim and the Baisusim. The Prushim were of the opinion that Mimachas HaShabbos means that was the Messiah from Moshe Rabbeinu going back to Har Sinai, that it's referring to the day after Pesach. And in fact, the Yontif that's mentioned right before this Parsha here in Parsha Semar, in the Parsha of the Mayadam, is the Yontif of Pesach. So Mimachas HaShabbos, after the first day of Pesach, in other words, the second day of Pesach, Tez Zayin Nisan on the calendar, there's a mitzvah to bring the carbon omer. So what was the carbon omer brought? It was Mimachras HaShabbos. Shabbos over here is a code word. What it really means is the second day of Pesach. In Chutz La'aretz, which is the first day of Chol HaMoed in Eretz Yisrael. That's when the carbon omer was brought. The Baisusim disagreed. The Baisusim said, it sounds to us like Mimachras HaShabbos is supposed to be on a Sunday. So they said it's the Sunday after Pesach starts. So if Pesach is Shabbos, that's the first day, then Enochinami, it's going to be Sunday. But let's say Pesach was on Tuesday, let's say it was on Wednesday, then it's not going to be Tazai and Nisan. Then you're going to have to count Yud Zayin, Chav, Chafal, whenever exactly it's going to be. So it's going to be around Pesach time, but it's not Mimachas HaShabbos, the second day of Pesach, meaning the day after the first day of Pesach, but rather it's a Sunday. Regardless, with that backdrop, we begin the daf. Zok the Mishnah, Keitzad, Hein, Oisin. So what was the process of cutting this Omer? So the Torah says that Uktzartem as Ketzira. So the Ketzira itself was a mitzvah. What was the process of the Ketzira? Shluchei Bezin Yoitzim Erev Yontif, Va'oisen Oisai Krichois, B'mechub Lekarka. Shluchei Bezin would go on Erev Yontif. So this is Erev Pesach. And they would make krichois. They would tie the Omer that they were going to be cut. Now they were going to be cutting the Omer on Motzai Yontif. the carbon was going to be brought the next day. All carbonos have to be brought during the day. With regards to the Chasayim, the Gemara is going to actually bring a pasuk that it had to be brought during the day, but the kitzira, the mitzvah of uktzartem, that didn't have to be during the day. Zrizim akdim el mitzvahs, that was done at night. And there was such a bechina of zrizas that took place over here that they would prep the Ketzira on Erev Yontif. So like this Maitzah Yontif, they can just go and they can cut it. So how did they prep it? They prepped it by identifying exactly what's going to be cut, and they would tie it with krichos. Anybody that was able to come and attend this cutting, this ceremony, was encouraged to come. The reason was because they wanted it to be a grace esek. They wanted a big tumult. As soon as it got dark, meaning Matzah Yantiv, Omer Lehem the Kaye, and as we're going to see soon, one of the three Kayhanim that cut the Omer would turn to the Yidden that were there and would say, Ba Hashemesh, did the sun set? Meaning it's already Rabbeinu Tam, it's 72, we could start cutting. Omer Hein. They would say yes. Ba Hashemesh. They would ask it. The other kohen would ask the same question. I'm Remain. The Mishnah doesn't mention the third kohen, but there was a third kohen here as well. So there were three kohanim that would ask the question, and as long as the yidden would answer in the affirmative, yes, 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 then they would move forward. Magel zu, and then they would continue. They would say, should we use this magel, this sekel? Is this okay to use? I'm Remhain. Magel zu, I'm Remhain. Kupa zu, should we put it into this kupa after we cut it? I'm Remhain. Kupa zu, I'm Remhain. This Shabbos, if let's say it was Shabbos, this tzira was Deicha Shabbos, they would say, I'm Remhain. Shabbos zu, yeah, on this Shabbos we could do it. I'm Remhain. Shabbos zu, I'm Remhain. Ektzar, vehem Imrim like Tsar, should we cut? They would say, yeah, Ektzar, vehem Imrim like Tsar. Point is, you get the gist, right? So every kohen would say this, and by the way, shalish pamim al kol dava v'dava vehem Imrim le hein hein hein. So it's a little confusing here. I am b'mefarshim, but basically what's happening is there's three kohanim that are saying this, and each kohen is saying it 3 times. So everything was said 9 times. Shabbazu, 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 9 times. Because 3 kohanim are saying it, and each kohen is saying it 3 times. And the Mishnah asks the very obvious question. The question we're all asking, why? Says the Mishnah, this was lahaitzi miliban, not shal tzedukim, but lahaitzi miliban shal habaisusim. And we wanted that it should be an Asa Gadol. People should be there, and we're going to make a big fuss about it. A fuss that really didn't have to be made. We could have done this a little bit more b'tznius. No, but we dafka want to make a big tumult because there was a whole group of Jews that were of the opinion that this was not the way it was supposed to be done. And really it was supposed to be done on a Sunday. So we want to show that we're not doing it on Sunday. We're doing it on Meitzah Yontif. Because our Messiah from Moshe Rabbeinu is Mimachras HaShabbos, means the day after the first day of Pesach. And to emphasize this point, this is what we did. It's just like you find in the beginning of Masechtas Yuma, Lahaitzi Miliban Shal Tzedaikin. This is a very, very similar concept. It's not Lahaitzi Miliban Shal Tzedaikin, but rather it's Lahaitzi Miliban Shal HaBaisusim. So we'll get back to the Baisusim, some hashtag rest of the story in a moment. Let's just learn a little bit of Gemara. Tanu Rabbanon, Ilain Yumaya Deloyle Sana Bahoin, Umikzasan Deloyle Mispadain. The following are days that you're not allowed to fast because of something very good that happened to the Jews on those days, and some of these days is even more chamer. Not only can't you fast, but if somebody who dies and there's a levaya, the loiva mispad behind, you can't make a haspid. What are those days? From Chodesh Nisan until the 8th day of Nisan, the carbon tamid was established, meaning it was established that the carbon tamid heretofore would be brought in the proper way, and it's for that reason it was a yontif, it was like a miniature yontif, and the loiva mispad, and it's for that reason no haspid on that day. From the 8th day of Nisan until after Pesach, it was during those days that the yontif of Shavuos, when exactly Shavuos is supposed to be celebrated, was established properly, and as a result, the loy changed the girsa loy lesana, and it's for that reason that you're not allowed to fast. Rashi says, "L'mispat shari," you could make a hesped, but you're not allowed to fast on those days. And the Gemara explains, what happened? What it means? The carbon tamid was established during the first 8 days of Chodesh Nisan. Because tzedaikim used to say, "Yachid misnadav maybe tamid," that if a yachid wants to donate the carbon tamid, he could bring the carbon tamid. My darish, what was the basis for what they said? Tasa Lashon Yachid. Sounds like even a Yachid is able to bring the carbon tamid. So the tzedaikim were of the opinion that if somebody wants to donate, he comes to the Beis Hamikdash, writes a $180 check, says, "I want you to buy a shepsela. The next carbon tamid is on me." It was okay. That was something that was ma'hadru. What did the Chachamim tell the tzedakah? Meaning, apparently this was an 8-day debate, and then finally it was established. What was the final argument that was that mashatashav lapikairis that eventually reigned? They said, "As karbani lachmi liishai tishmeru," and tishmeru is a lashon rabbim, and we learn from this yikulam bam b'shumas halishka. And again, this is something that we're very familiar with, right? Everybody knows that the Yidden, once upon a time, when there was a Beis Hamikdash, there was a mitzvah essay deraisa for every single Jew, from the age of 20 to 60, bar mitzvahs, all tumul, Levim, Kayanim, Nashim. But there was an idea to give a machzas hashekel, and the purpose of the machzas hashekel was to buy the karbanos sibur, such as the tamid, such as the musafin, the karbanos that were brought on Yantif. And the reason it was done that way was so that every yachid should have a chelik, he should have shears in the karbanos sibur that were being brought. So the way every member of Klal Yisrael had a chelik of the karbanos sibur was by contributing. And you contributed a machzas hashekel. The machzas hashekel that we give today is a zecher for the machzas hashekel that we once gave. Because the real machzas hashekel wasn't just a mitzvah of tzedakah, give $1.50 and the tzedakah should go to somebody. No, this was money that was given to the Beis Hamikdash. It was like a tax. But the point was that every yid should have a chelik of the carbon too. And karbanei tzibur had to be brought by the machzas shekel. You were not allowed to go, and a big veer couldn't show up at the Beis Hamikdash and write a check and say, I want to cover the machzas. It doesn't work that way. The machzas shekel had to be paid for by each individual. Apparently, the tzedakим didn't agree. It's went back and forth. 8 days. Which 8 days? The first 8 days of Chodesh Nisan. And as a result, it was listed as one of the mini Yomim Tovim that once upon a time existed. The Leila Mispad behind. Okay, and then from the 8th day until after Yontif, they established Yontif of Shavuos, and therefore the Leila Sana. And that too is a yontif. It's not as big a yontif, but it's a yontif as well. The Leila Sana, you're not allowed to fast on those days. What happened? Shahayu Baisusim Oimrim, so not the tzedaikim, but the Baisusim used to say Atzeres Achar HaShabbos, that Shavuos always falls out on a Sunday. Nitfal Lehem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, V'amar Lehem Shoitim, Inayim Lachem. How do you know that? And there was nobody that knew. I was like, I don't know. We never thought of that. There was one out the Yid, and he answered Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he said, Moshe Rabbeinu Oyev Yisrael Haya. Moshe Rabbeinu was an Oyev Yisrael. Okay. The idea is he knew that Shavuos, it's 1 day. The whole Yontif is only 1 day. So what he did was he made Shavuos fall out on a Sunday. It's like this. You can have a 2-day Yontif. Yerushalmi Yid once told me that he thinks the reason in Chutz La'aretz you have 2 days Yontif and Yisrael is only 1 day Yontif. He says it's the Eibush they're rewarding the Anshe Chutz La'aretz because they support the Yid in Eretz Yisrael. There's a Makar in this Gemara. So Moshe Rabbeinu Oyev, from Baisusi, but Moshe Rabbeinu Oyev Yisrael Haya, v'yodeya she'atzeres yoyim echad. But the point is, right, there's merit to the thought, to the machshava. But so this is what he told him. He says, no, I'm telling you, Shavuos always falls out on a Sunday. It's like this. You can have a 2-day Eretz Yisrael. They also want to have a 2-day yontif. It's like this. You can end up having a 2-day yontif. Kara of Mikras Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai told this by Susi. He says, if Moshe Rabbeinu really loved the Jews so much, maybe you could explain this to me. The Yidden are Mekabel the Torah by Har Chayre, by Har Sinai. They're 11 days from the Promised Land. The Moshe Rabbeinu Oyev Yisrael Haya. Lama Ichara Bamidbar Bam Shana. What took so long? So why did it take 40 years in the Midbar? Amalai Rebbe. So the Baisusi, this Zokain, turns to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and he tells him, this is the, come on, you know that. We all know what happened. They were in the Midbar for 40 years, not because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't love the Jews. Amalai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai told him, Shaita, V'loitei Torah Shlema Shalanu, Kesicha, Beteva Shalachem. He says, of course I know I'm telling you something silly. But the reason I'm saying something silly to you, says Rashi, is because you said something silly to me. What I'm saying is the zel b'shtusim as what you're saying. You're coming here with svaras. Moshe Rabbeinu was an Oyev Yisrael, and the Meilat Tzeres is supposed to fall out on a Sunday. That's absolutely ridiculous. Now the truth is, let's take a step back. What was the basis? What was the scriptural source for what this Baisusi was saying? It was the pasuk. The pasuk says that you're supposed to bring the Karban Omer Mimacharas HaShabbos, and then you're supposed to count 49 days. And on the 50th day, which is again going to be Mimacharas HaShabbos, do the math, right? 50 days after Mimacharas HaShabbos will be a Mimacharas HaShabbos again. And that's when you're going to celebrate the Yontiv of Shavuos. So just by Susi said Mimacharas HaShabbos means Sunday. 50 days from Sunday is going to be a Sunday again. So the bottom line is, that's how I know that it's supposed to be on a Sunday. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, of course, had the Messiah of the Prussian, the Messiah from Sinai, which was Mimacharas HaShabbos doesn't mean Sunday. Mimacharas HaShabbos means the second day of Pesach. It means Tez Zayin Nisan. It doesn't matter if it's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, or Sunday. But it doesn't have to be a Sunday. But the question was, is there a scriptural source to the argument of the Prussian? And this is where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai told him, he says, I'm going to prove it to you from the Torah. I'll prove to you from the Torah that I'm right. Because Kasav Echadam, one pasuk says, Tispru Cham Yishim Yoy. Kasav Echadam, another pasuk says, Sheva Shabbosos So one pasuk says you're supposed to count 50 days. And again, it's not 50 days, it's really 49 days. Incidentally, if you take a look at the top Tosfos right here, we're not going to go into it, but the top Tosfos asks that if the Torah says Tispru Chamishim Yoim, then why do we only count 49 days? So Tosfos says two pshatim in the pshat in the pasuk, that although the Torah says Chamishim Yoim, but the way you're supposed to read it, just pashit, the way you read the pasuk is not count 50 days and then the following day celebrate Yontif and bring the Mincha Chadasha, but rather count 49 days. The 50th day is the day that you're supposed to bring it. That's different than, for example, when the Torah says Arbam Yakeno, give 40 malchus, and we know it's only 39. And Chazal say that you see from there the koyach of the Chachamim that the Torah Shebal Peh can sometimes trump the Torah Shebiksav, because the Torah says Arbam Yakeno. The Chachamim came along and they said it's not 40, it's really 39. This is different. This doesn't fall into the same category. Over here, when the Torah says Tispru Chamishim Yoim, take a look at Tosfos, two pshatim, Rashi and Chumash brings one of Tosfos, two pshatim. Is the Torah is telling you that on the 50th you're supposed to count 49, but the point that says Tispru Chamishim Yoim, you're supposed to count 49 days. Another pasuk says Sheva Shabbos it's 7 full weeks. What's the stira? The stira is in one place, it sounds like just any random 49 days. Sheva Shabbos says to me, Moistiana seems to suggest a full week. A full week starts on Sunday and it ends on Shabbos. And then you go through the end of the week. Right? That's what a week is. So is it a full week or 7 full weeks? Or is it just 49 days? It doesn't matter if it starts in the middle of the week. Seems to be a stira. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, must be. Can be Yontif Shecholias b'Shabbos. Can be Yontif Shecholias b'Emtza Shabbos. It could be either one. If Tez Zayin Nisan is a Sunday, says it's going to be Sheva Shabbos is Temimos. If Tez Zayin ben Nisan falls out on a Tuesday, then it's not going to be Sheva Shabbos is Temimos. Then it's going to be Tispru Chamishim Yoim. But said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to the Baisusi, instead of us arguing over silly arguments, you're going to tell me that you think Mimachas HaShabbos means Sunday because then Shavuos will fall out on a Sunday, and Moshe Rabbeinu loves the Jews, he wants to have a 2-day Yontif. Come on. That's not the way we're going to reconcile this argument. The way we're going to reconcile this argument is with Psukei HaTorah. And I'm telling you, in the Psukim, it's mashma like me. Tispru Chamishim Yom sounds like any 49 days, as long as they're in succession, but starting even from a Tuesday. Sheva Shabbos says to me, it sounds like it has to start on a Sunday. So before we go weiter, and the Gemara is going to go from here and bring many scriptural rayas to the Perushim, not like the Baisusim, let's just give a little bit of an introduction. Who exactly were the Baisusim? So we're familiar with the Tzaddikim. The Tzaddikim come up throughout Shas. This Tzeddiki, that Tzeddiki. So that's something that is featured a lot. The Baisusim aren't mentioned as much. But the truth is that the history of the Tzaddikim and the Baisusim are very much interrelated. And really it begins with an Avos Rab Nosson. The Mishnah, right in the beginning of Pirkei Avos, when it discusses the Messiah, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, the Messiah, Yeshua the Zkenim, Anshe Knesset Agdoila. Shimon HaTzadik was from the Shiori Anshe Knesset Agdoila. He used to say, Al Shlosh Dvar Moilam Oimed, Al HaTorah Avayla Gmilas Chasadim, and he had a Talmud that he gave over his Messiah to. His Talmud's name was Antignus Ish Soichai. Antignus Ish Soicha used to say, "Who are you?" It's the third Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Altiu kavodim amasham shenesarav amanas lekavu pras. Elehevu kavodim amasham shenesarav shloy amanas lekavu pras. Vihi moira shamayim a lechen. The Avos Rab Nosson says that Antigonus Ish Soichai had many, many Talmidim. Amongst his many Talmidim, there was a fellow named Sadok and another fellow named Baisus. And when they heard Antigonus Ish Soichai say this Mishnah, Al Tiyu Kavadim HaMishamshin as a rabbi, don't serve Hashem because of an Olam Haba that you're waiting to get one day. Elo Tiyu Kavadim HaMisham, you should see yourself like an Eved who's not getting paid, who doesn't get a paycheck, who does his work 100% l'shem shamayim. And who haya omer? This was Antigonus Ish Soichai's memra that made it into Pirkei Avos. This was part and parcel of his Ashkafas HaChaim. This is what he was always teaching his Talmidim. And they heard it again and again and again, and then something, it for some reason, clicked in them that made them think, something, maybe the Rebbe keeps on saying this, not because he wants us to have a certain mindset in terms of how he wants to serve Hashem, but maybe because there really is no reward. And maybe he's telling us, because frankly, there's not going to be an reward. And one thing led to another, and by the time they were done, they were koifrin tchias hamesim, and they left the fold, and they started movements respectively. Tzaddik started a movement known as the Tzaddikim. Baisus started a movement that would later be known as the Baisusim. The Deiris HaRishayim says that like many movements, like the movement of Yeshai HaNoitzri, at the time of Tzaddik and Baisus' life, they really have that much of a following. It didn't take too much root. It started off with a minion of followers. But as the years went on, the movement of the Tzaddikim and the Baisusim became stronger and stronger. And if you read Yosef Ben Gurion, also known as Josephus, he talks so much about the Sadducees. He doesn't talk a lot about the Baisusim. I don't even know if he mentions the Baisusim. But he talks a lot about the Tzaddikim, about the Sadducees, and they were a very, very, very big deal. And you see in the Sugi, they were a very big deal. You see Chazal went out of their way with the Ketir Soimer. Why are we so worried about them? Because obviously they were a real movement, and the Chachamim spent a lot of time and a lot of energy to defeat the Tzaddikim and the Baisus. Eventually they were defeated, but it took up a lot of time during the Tkufa of Bayasheni. Regardless, those were the Tzaddikim and the Baisusim. Now, it's interesting, sometimes you find the Tzaddikim mentioned, and sometimes you find the Baisusim mentioned. In this brisa that we just learned now, on Samechei Amud Aleph, you have one brisa that talks about the first 8 days of Nisan were a mini Yantif, and then the next several days were a mini Yantif as well. The first 8 days, because they defeated the Tzaddikim to establish the Karban Talmud. And then the next week or so is a Yantif, because they defeated the Baisusim with regards to the Yantif of Shua. So you see the Tzaddikim and the Baisusim, even though they're synonymous with each other, they come together very often, but they're clearly not the same. What exactly the difference was, so we'll have to leave that up for the historians to figure out. But it's not so clear what the difference was between the Tzaddikim and the Baisusim, but what it is clear, they were not the same movement. But I'll just tell you one interesting thing. The Rambam in Hilchas Tshuva, so at the very end in Perek Yud, every Rambam there is classic. But the Rambam, in the end of every Sivkot has a sticker. But the Rambam, in the end of Hilchas Tshuva, he talks about the premier way of how you're supposed to serve Hashem, and he talks about serving Hashem me'ahava. And says the Rambam, here's the punchline: V'chein hayu gedolei hachachamim mitzavim lenevoinei talmideihem umaskileim beyichud. Listen to L'shonei Hazav Shalei Rambam. So after the Rambam talks about a person shouldn't serve Hashem, not for reward, not miyira even. It should be me'ahava. V'chein hayu gedolei hachachamim mitzavim. This is what the Gedolei Hachachamim used to tell. Nevoinei talmideihem umaskileim beyichud. They're choshev talmidim. Al tiyu kavodim amisham shenes harav al manas kabul toiva. Eleheyu kavodim amisham shenes harav al manas shaloi lekabel klub. Ele mebnei shahu harav royu l'shamshoy koloymar. In short, says the Rambam, ivdu me'ahava. That's the translation of that Mishnah. So the Rambam brings the Mishnah. It's the third Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Perek Aleph Mishnah Gimel. It's Antigonus Ish Soichai's memra. But the Rambam prefaces it by saying, Gedolei HaChachamim hayu mitzavim lenevoinei talmideihem umaskileihem beyichud. Zok the Kesef Mishnah, 2 lines. Says the Kesef Mishnah, you know why the Rambam goes out of his way to say that the Gedolei HaChachamim would only tell this Mishnah over to nevoinei talmideihem umaskileihem beyichud? It's not, they didn't tell to everybody. It was something that was said betzina, for people that can handle it. It wasn't meant for public consumption. You know why? Because because look what happened to Tzaddik Ubaisus. who clearly were not on the pay grade where they were able to handle this Mishnah. Kasav, it's for that reason the Rambam wrote, Shahayu mitzabin talmidei u'maskileim beyichud, K'loi marzok tekesav Mishnah, v'loi l'kulam. Not for everybody. Because not everybody is ready to handle this Mishnah. It's interesting that the Mishnah says, Antignos Yesoichoi, Altiu Kavadam Sham Shenetzarav, Elo Yehevu Kavadam Sham Shenetzarav, Shaloi Manas Kavah Pras, and then the Mishnah says, Vihi Moira Shamayim Aleichem. So in the past, we've spoken out a Moira de Heilige B'nei Yisachar who says Pshad in the Hemshach of Vihi Moira Shamayim Aleichem, the In Kamakoimoi. But I was thinking, Pashim Pshad, maybe that's what the Mishnah means to say. Altiu Kavadam Sham Shenetzarav, Manas Kavah Pras. But this is the halacha that got people into trouble. Tzadikim Baisus. And that's why the Rambam says, not everybody was supposed to have it. So says the Mishnah, Vihi Moira Shamayim Aleichem. What's the smichos? What's the hemshach? Very simple. I'm telling you something, but make sure you keep your Yiras Shamayim, because this Mishnah actually caused others to lose their Yiras Shamayim. Regardless, the Baisusim were a very big deal. I'll tell you, I saw in the Pardas Yosef, he brings from the Sefer Divrei Shal. So the Pardas Yosef brings that when we count Sfiras HaOmer, so the first day that we count is Hayoim Yoim Echad La'omer. Then it's Hayoim Sheni, Hayoim Shlishi. You know, the Hayoim Echad is a pasuk in the Torah. Vayerev Vayivoker Yoim Echad. Rashi famously asks that why is it Vayerev Vayivoker Yoim Echad? It should have said Yoim Rishon. Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi. That would be the proper grammar. So why is it Yoim Echad? It's Rashi's kasha. Rashi says because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Echad Ba'ilama, and that's why he says Vayerev Vayivoker Yoim Echad. So Freik the Divrei Shal, I'll ask you the same kasha. When we count Sfiras HaOmer, why do we say Hayoim Yoim Echad La'omer or Ba'omer? It should be Hayoim Yoim Rishon. If it's going to be Sheni, Shlishi, and Revi, Rashi's kasha. Rashi right in the beginning of Sefer Bereshis. Vayerev Vayivoker Yoim Echad, it should have been Yoim Rishon. So why do we say Yoim Echad, not Yoim Rishon? So he said Lahoitzi miliban shalat baisusim. Because if you would say Yoim Rishon on that one day, what does Yoim Rishon sound like? Yoim Rishon l'Shabbos. It sounds like it's Sunday. So Lahoitzi miliban shalat tzedaikim. You don't even want to say baisusim Rishon. So you say Hayoim Yoim Echad. Not Hayoim Yoim Rishon. Either way, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a tshuva. He told this by Susi that I'm going to prove you wrong, and he proved him wrong by reconciling this apparent contradiction between two psukim that describe the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. On the one hand, it says Tisbru Chamishim Yoim. It sounds like any 49 days. On the other hand, it says Sheva Shabbosos Timimois Tiano. It sounds like it has to be 7 complete weeks. And the only way it makes sense, said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is if there's 2 dinim. Sometimes it's Sheva Shabbosos Timimois. Sometimes it's only 49 days. Hakait said if Pesach falls out on a Shabbos, then you're going to start counting on a Sunday. It's going to be Sheva Shabbosos Timimois. If not, it's going to be in the middle of the week. Regardless, this is one of many, many pshatim that's going to take us 2/3 of the way down to Daf Samech Vav and Aleph, so we'll start the Gemara and we'll finish it tomorrow. So Rabbi Eliezer Soifer, Rabbi Yeshua Moina, Rabbi Shimon Ma'amer, Rabbi Yehuda Lamatis, and Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Rabbi Eliezer said, and there's a lot of issues with the Gersoyos in this Gemara, so you have to hold on tight here. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein Eitzarech, Hareu Omer, the pasuk says, Tispar L'cha. Said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, you didn't need to prove this by Susi wrong from Tisbru Chamishim Yoim and Sheva Shabbosos Timimois. It's more pashut. It says that Shiva Shavuos Tispar Lach. Now, this pasuk is actually not in Pashas Amar. It's in Dvarim Perek Tezayim, but it's also talking about the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer, and it says over there Tispar Lach. And we learn from this Sfira Tliya Bebezdin, that we're dealing with a Sfira that's totally in Bezdin, Shehein Yoiden Lechadesh Mi Machras HaShabbos. Skip to Rabbi Yeshua. I'm sorry. Yotze Shabbos Bereishis Shes Sfirasa B'Chal. But the point is, it says Tispar Lach. It sounds like the Sfira should start depending on a day that's Tali and Bezdin. Bezdin controls the month. They don't control the days of the week. The Bezdin doesn't decide when it's Shabbos, but Bezdin decides when it's Yontif. How so? Because Bezdin decides when it's Rosh Chodesh, and based on that, they're indirectly deciding when it's Yontif. So if it says Tispar Lach, Sfira Tluya Bezdin, so it sounds like Mimachras HaShabbos means after a day that Bezdin has some control over. It must be we're talking about Pesach, which is something that indirectly Bezdin controls as opposed to Shabbos, which is something they have no control over. Rabbi Shua says, Amr Torah Manei Yom V'Kadosh Chodesh. The Torah said you should count days and then make it Rosh Chodesh. Manei Yomim V'Kadosh Atzeres. And the Torah also said count days, 49 days, and then it should be Shavuos. Just like Rosh Chodesh, right around Rosh Chodesh time, you already know it's going to be Rosh Chodesh. Because how did they know it was Rosh Chodesh? You saw it.
the moon disappears at the end of the month, and then as soon as they saw the Moiled, so they knew that it was Rish Chodesh. So it was Nikar Samach L'Biyasei. Shavuos has to be Nikar Samach L'Biyasei as well. Ve'im Toimer Atzeres Leilam Achar Shabbos Eich Tei Nikeres Mishal Lefanel. So that only works if we're going to go based on the month. Because if you're going to go based on the day after Pesach, so as soon as it's Pesach, you're always going to know when you're supposed to start counting. But if it's the day after the Shabbos after Pesach, so it's not so intrinsically nicker. Thus, Rabbi Yeshua said that's the raya, not like the Baisusin, the Menachos HaShabbos means after Pesach. Because everybody knows when the first day Pesach is. Similar to the fact that people see the Moiled. So it's Samach L'Biyasei, like, oh, today's Pesach? Oh, tomorrow, right? That's the way it is. You know when you're counting Sphira, when it's Pesach. Oh, today was Pesach, tomorrow you're counting Sphira. But if it's going to be the Sunday, then you already have to start holding Cheshbonis. When Shabbos Chol Moed, it's the day after that. It's not Samach L'Biyasei nicker. Regardless, that was Rabbi Yeshua's Makar. Bishmol, Rabbi Yeshua said a fourth pshat. Amr Torah, Havei Omer V'Pesach, V'Shtei Halechem Ba'at Seres. The Torah said that on Pesach you bring the carbon omer, and on Shavuos you bring the Shtei Alechem. Just like Shavuos, when you bring the Shtei Alechem, it's Yontif, and it's also the beginning of Yontif. The whole Yontif is one day. Afkan Regel v'Tchilas Regel. So too, you're supposed to bring the carbon omer on Yontif, but b'Tchilas Regel, which according to the Prushim, it's always going to be Tchilas Regel. It's always going to be the second day Pesach. Whereas according to the Baisusin, it's not always necessarily going to be Tchilas Regel. Rabbi Yehuda, some have the Gersa Rabbi Yeshua, Memesei Omer, Nema Shabbos L'Maylo, V'Neva Shabbos L'Mato. It says Shabbos, again, in the context of the Shtei Alechem, it says Shabbos in the context of the Karban Omer, Ma'ala Halon Regel, V'Tchilas Regel Samuchla. Just like over there, it's Yontif, and it's Samuch to the Tchilas HaRegel. Avkan Regel, V'Tchilas Regel Samuchla. Here too, with regards to the Karban Omer, it's Yontif, and it has to be Samuch to the Tchilas HaRegel. Very similar to the previous Pshat. Take a look at Rashi. I'm not sure I understand 100% the difference between the two Pshatim. But regardless, it's very, very similar in that we're dealing with a Zman that's Samuch to Tchilas HaRegel. Regardless, we have 5 pshatim over here in this brayser from the Gedolei Atanot. We have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we have Rabbi Eliezer, we have Rabbi Yeshua, we have Rabbi Yishmael, we have Rabbi Yehuda ben Mesaira, that all brought Mekairis. This is of course a Mesaira, but they all had Mekairis in the Psukim itself to prove that we're supposed to start counting Menachos HaShabbos, meaning Tez Zayin Nisan, not on the first Sunday that follows Pesach. So the Gemara now is going to bring another brayser that's going to bring a whole nother list of Mekairis in the Torah. How exactly you know Menachos HaShabbos means Tez Zayin Nisan. So we're not going to go through the whole brayso. We'll pick that up tomorrow morning. But just to pick up now the first line of the brayso, we'll speak out some rate on that. Tanu Rabbanon Usfartem Lochem. So following the bringing of the Karban Omer, you had to count Sfiras Omer, 49 days. Says the Torah, it says Usfartem Lochem. Why Lochem? Shetehei Sfira L'chalecha V'echad. Torah's come to emphasize that everybody's supposed to count. Now, if you take a look at the Hilig Rashi, L'chal Echad Ve'echad, one line. L'shekol Echad Chayiv Lisper. Everybody's obligated to count Sfiras Omer. What would have been the Havamina? That not everybody's obligated to count Sfiras Omer. So Tosfos already addresses the question. Tosfos Dibra Amaskul Usfartem Lachem. And Tosfos says that being that you find by Yovel, the Torah says V'safarta L'cha. And Safarta L'cha over there means Bezdin. Bezdin has an obligation to count. So there would have been a Havamina that maybe it's Bezdin that has the obligation to count Sfiras Omer. Maybe not everybody's obligated to count Sfiras Omer. Maybe it's Bezdin. Says the Mara, it says in the Torah, Usfartam Lachem. By Yovel, it says V'safarta L'cha. That's a Lashon Yachid. Over here, it says Usfartam Lachem. What's the emphasis of Usfartam Lachem? Lohidiyacha, Kamash Malon, that it's not Bezdin's obligation, but every single Yid has his own individual obligation to count Sfiras HaOmer. Stating that, there's another pshat in the Rishonim, and that is the Rashba. And the Rashba in the Tshuva says an unbelievable chiddush. Zok the Rashba in the Tshuva, he says, you know what the emphasis of Usfartem Lachem is? That every Shetei Sfir L'chalecha V'echad, we know that anytime there's a mitzvah to say something, you don't have to say it. You can hear somebody else say it, say Amen, and you can be Yaitza with what we know as Shemei Ka'ina. So for example, Friday night, you can be Yaitza your Kiddush with somebody else. You don't have to hear your own Kiddush. You can be Yaitza with the Balabas's Kiddush. As long as you say Amen, you're Mechavan to be Yaitza. He's Mechavan to be Yaitza you. What if you weren't Mechavan? Sug is in the end of Masechtas Rosh Hashanah. But this is a halacha, Revachas Bi Yisrael, that there's something called Shemei Ka'ina, and it's something that we all rely on a regular basis. Shemei Ka'ina. Zok the Rashba, could I be Yaitza Sfiras HaOmer with Shemei Ka'ina? So you're going to count the night of the Omer, and I'm going to listen to what you said, and I'll be Yaitza with your Sfiras HaOmer. Says the Rashba, no. That's this
Gemara. Usfartum lachem shetei sfira l'chol echad ve'echad. Not that everybody's obligated to count. Of course everybody's obligated to count. That's not a chiddush. I don't need the word lachem to teach me that there's an obligation. Lachem is coming to teach me that every single person needs to count on his own. That you cannot be yotzei to Shemei HaKoinah. So even though ordinarily in Kol HaTorah Kula there's a concept called Shemei HaKoinah, but when it comes to Sfira Sa'omer, there's no such concept of Sfira Sa'omer. It's interesting, this is brought down in halacha. The Mishabur, right in the beginning of Simon Tov Pei Tes, brings this halacha. Chaber says, Belel Sheni, Achat Tfilas Arvis, second night Pesach, after Ma'ariv, Maschilim Lisfar HaOmer. V'em Shochach Lisfar, Betchilas HaLayla, Hoylech V'Sefer Kol HaLayla. Supposed to do it right away, right after Ma'ariv, but if you didn't do it, you have the whole night to do it. Mitzvah says the Mechaber, Al Kol Echad Lispar La'atzmai. There's a mitzvah for every Yachid to count for himself. Says the Mishabura, the Chsivu Sfartum Lachem. Mashma sha mitzvah chal al kol yachid v'yachid. V'hine. Says the Mishabura, mashma mized, the sfira ain't kamei b'shar mitzvah talui b'amira. It sounds like sfira is different than ordinary mitzvahs that are talui b'amira. L'inyan kiddush v'avdolu ki yoytz v'hem. Dim shama l'chaveiroi v'neschavim lotzis di yoytz b'zeh mishum d'sheh kamei ha'koyim. V'hacha gilsa ha'toyre d'lo yotz. Here the Torah is being megala that you're not yoytz v'chemei ha'koyim. Kol kama d'lo siper ba'atzmai. You have to count by yourself. And if you don't count by yourself, you can't be yoytz v'chemei. Aval yesh machreinim shekos the kavanas ha'toyru who racked the loy name of the mitzvahs who have best in levatkoi. That when it says that every person is obligated, it doesn't mean that you have to count by yourself as opposed to Shemei HaKoinah. If Shemei HaKoinah works, then it's as if you counted. So that's not what it means. What it means is that Bezdin's not up. Kamei b'shmitim v'yoyvlas. T'chsiv sham b'safar t'lecha. Elikoi yad tzibor. Who's the other pshat? That's Tosfos. So regardless, the Rashba who learned it in Rashi and Tosfos, these two pshatim and the Rishonim are both brought down in the Mishabura in Hilchas Pesach and Siman Tov Pei Tes. Now it's interesting, this halacha is with regards to the actual counting of the Sfiras Omer. What about the bracha? What about the Birchas HaMitzvahs for Sfiras Omer? Could you be yotzei the bracha with Shemei HaKoinah? And that comes in handy if you ever forget to count. And now you have a suffix, because really it's not so clear that if you miss one night, that you're not allowed to count with a bracha anymore. It's really a suffix. So you essentially have a suffix bracha. Suffix brachas you don't count. What's the Eitzah? Let somebody else be mitziu. But we just said that it's not so pashit. It could be there's no Shemei HaKoinah. So what would be the halacha Shemei HaKoinah? Says the Mishabura, that's pashit, that the whole issue of Shemei HaKoinah regarding Sfiras HaOmer is with regards to the actual Sfira. But as it relates to the Birchas HaMitzvahs of Sfiras HaOmer, there's no difference between the Birchas HaMitzvahs of Sfiras HaOmer and any ordinary Birchas HaMitzvahs, and of course that you would be able to be Yitzhak Shemei HaKoinah. In fact, if you look at Reb Kvegas HaGoyes in Shulchan Aruch, right here in Siman Tov Pei Tes, he brings that the minig is, and it's the proper thing to do, is to have one person make the Birchas HaMitzvahs and everybody else should be Yitzhak with him. And the reason is B'roiv Am Hadras Melech. And Reb Kvegas says, you want precedence for this? Take a look in Hilchas Shabbos, Simin Reish Tzadik Ches, the laws of Havdalah, and over there the Mechaber says that when it comes to making the bracha, B'roiv Me'orei Ha'esh, one person should make the bracha and he should be mitzi everybody else, which is of course the minig. You don't make your own bayru mariyesh, but you're yaitzi. You say amen to the bracha of the mavarech. You're yaitzi with Shemei HaKoinah, and you do it. Why? What's the reason for it? So the Paiskim say, as I state in Shulchan Aruch, because of B'roiv Am Hadras Melech. So there's actually an idea of B'roiv Am Hadras Melech to have one person be mitzi other people. So says Reb Kiva Eger, it's true with regards to the actual Sfiras HaOmer, that's already totally Bashlei, Rav Revi, a Rajban, a Tshuva, based on a Gemara, Menachos, Samachayim, base. It could be that even though the Shemei HaKoinah and Kol HaTorah Kula, but when it comes to this, there's not going to be Shemei. But that's only with regards to the Sfira itself. But as it relates to the bracha, to the contrary, Hadar Dina, it makes sense for one person. So Reb Kiva Eger is seemingly suggesting that the Shliach Tzibur should get up after Ma'ariv, clap, he says the bracha Sfiras HaOmer, and then everybody else will just say Amen, and it gives you less incentive not to miss. But everybody else will say Amen, and like this, you have no problems. So you'll make the Sfiras HaOmer. But then Reb Kiva Eger just adds one line. He says, Ayin Shailas Teshuvas Mabit. Sends you to the Mabit. If you take a look at the Mabit, Reb Kiva Eger's being Mitzayin says that the Minig Yisrael was not that way. And as I state in Mishabura, so Mishabura brings that even though it's Pashit, that this Peido regarding Shemei HaKoinah is only talking about the sphere, it's not talking about the bracha, but at the same time, the Minig Yisrael is, read it to you, Minig b'chol Yisrael shechalecha mevarech v'soifer la'atzmai ve'ein soimchin al hashatz. And the makar to that is this Shalos Teshuvas Mabit that Reb Kiva Eger was being mitzayim. But the question is very, very obvious.
So it's Mavu in the Rishonim, the Mishaburu brings it lahalacha, that even though in Kol HaTorah Kula Shemei Kaina, but when it comes to Sfiras HaOmer, there's no Shemei Kaina. And the reason is because it says Usfartum Lachem Shetei Sfira L'chal Echad Ve'echad, two understandings in the Rishonim what exactly that means. But according to one pshat and the way the Rashba understood Rashi, so that would seem to make it the Pasha pshat in the sugya is Shetei Sfira L'chal Echad Ve'echad, that you can't be Yotzei Shemei Kaina. And the question is Manishtana Sfiras HaOmer Mikol mitzvah shebetorah. If there's ever a mitzvah that's told in Amira, you could be Yaitza. That was a pun. Shemei Kaina. Then why is it that you can't be Yaitza the mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer with Shemei Kaina? So there's a lot of lamdish mahalchim that all really hinge on the same idea, which is that the mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is not a mitzvah to recite the day of the Omer. Meaning it's not a mitzvah samira, but it's a mitzvah sfira. And sfira, counting and talking are not the same thing. You can be yotza talking with Shemei Kaina. You can't be yotza counting with Shemei Kaina. But I'll just tell you something that I saw in the Sefer Yerach L'Mayadim. That's the Sefer of the Shiva of Yeruchim, and he brings what he refers to as a davar na'eh in the Sefer Kuruye Mayed. Again, why is it that there's no Shemei Kaina when it comes to the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer? And that is based on something that is brought down in the Sefer HaPardes. So the Sefer HaPardes was one of the Rishonim, and the Sefer HaPardes says as follows: V'tzorech levarech b'kol ram mishum dechsiv u'sfartem lechem. So somehow the Sefer HaPardes saw in the words u'sfartem lechem that it's not enough to say Sfiras HaOmer, but it has to be b'kol ram. Sfiras HaOmer has a din that it has to be b'kol ram. Based on that, said Rabbi Yeruchim, you could stel to the raid, the dvarim atikin, by Duchanim. There was machlekes between the Beis Halevi and the Netziv. A kohen that goes up to Duchen. Birchas Kohanim. Could one kohen say the Birchas Kohanim and be moitzi other kohanim with Shemei Kaina? Or no? Does each kohen have to do it by himself? Is there a loch of Shemei Kaina by Birchas Kohanim or not? One of the rayas that the Netziv brought, it's in Meroy Meisada, Mesachtes Megillah, Daf Chav Dalet and Aleph, is the Mishnah Mesachtes Megillah says, Hamafter b'Navi hu poiris al Hashma, v'hu oiver lefnei ateva, v'hu noisei eskapa. So whoever went mafter, there were certain fringe benefits that came along with going mafter. He was poiris al Shma, he was oiver lefnei ateva. So today you just got the Haftarah. V'hu noisei eskapa. Freak the Netziv, v'hu noisei eskapa. Obviously we're talking about a kohen, right? He's noisez kapav. What if you're kohen? Then you're noisez kapav anyways. Every kohen is supposed to be noisez kapav. Zokten it said no, because really Nesias Kapayim is like every other mitzvah that's totally in dibur. Where you can be yotzei with Shemei Kaina, and that was the minute. One person, one kohen would get up, and he would be mitzi all the kohanim with Shemei Kaina. So who had the schus to be the one to say it, and everybody else is just saying amen? It was the one that was over lefnei ateva, hamafter benavi, who peiros hashma, who over lefnei ateva, and he's the one that's going to be mitzi the olam. He's the one that's nicest kap of hafla of a fella. But can you do it the Beis Halevi and Sefer Beis Halevi argue? He vehemently argued with the Netziv. And he said a chap. He said, you know why? Because the Gemara says that duchening has to be b'kol ram. It's not enough that the kohen gets up. You know, the kohanim scream. They're supposed to. They're supposed to scream. It has to be b'kol ram. It's halacha and Shulchan Aruch. It's midina the Gemara that the kohanim have to say b'kol ram. So the Beis Halevi said a chap. Shemei Kaina is the pshat that it's as if I said it. But is it b'kol ram? I'm not making any noise. How can it be b'kol ram? So I can tuoif amira and dibur al yidei Shemei Kaina. A b'kol ram, that's not something I could tuoif. And really, it's totally in the lumdus of how Shemei Kaina works. Is the pshat in Shemei Kaina that when I hear what you're saying, I shtel zechzu to your dibur? So whatever you did through my shmiya, it's as if I did. So even though you're talking, I'm medaber mitoich groincha, so to speak. Even though you're the one that's talking, I'm also talking. I'm a shutif in your dibur. Or is the pshat, not that I'm a shutaf in your dibur, but ordinarily in order to talk, you have to talk. Over here, you can be a medaber just by being shemeya. But it's the shmiya that's the dibur, so to speak. Ordinarily, shmiya l'chod, v'dibur l'chod. Shemei Kaina was mechadish, that shmiya bleibs dibur. So is my dibur my shmiya, or my dibur is really your dibur? It's just through my shmiya that I'm a shutef in your dibur. L'may nafkamina this shayla. If there's a din kol ram, if the pshat is that I have your dibur, so if your dibur was b'kol ram, why shouldn't I have the b'kol ram? But if the word is that I don't have your dibur, I have my own dibur. My dibur was my shmiya. So it's very nice. Shmiya is a dibur, but it's not b'kol ram because you're not making any noise. It reminds me that when we learned the Megillah,
So by the Haseres Pnei Haman, everybody says that's Parshan Dasa, right? Everybody says it. So why does everybody say it? Why can't you be Yaitza with the Shliach Tzibur like you Yaitza everything else? So Pesh Pesach Frank in Mikroi Kodesh brings from the Rogachover Goyen that the Rogachover said, you know why? He says because there's a halacha that it has to be b'nashim ma'achas. Nashim ma'achas you can't get with Shemei Kaina. Says the Dibur that you can get with Shemei Kaina, but the Nashim ma'achas that you can't get b'Shemei Kaina. But Al Kapadim said there was Shiva Rabbi Yeruchim in the Sefer Yerachim Ayadim that it could be like this Sefer Apardis. That Sphere Sa'omer is like duchaning. It's like Nasias Kapayim. It has to be b'Kol Ram. Beis Halevi's Yisoid that whenever there's a din Kol Ram, you can't be Yaitz with Shemei Kaina. Here too, you wouldn't be able to be Yaitz with Shemei Kaina either. Either way, Mitzvah tomorrow we'll speak at a lot more raid regarding Sphere Sa'omer.